I call the Honourable Member Sata Sam Lotuinga.
I move that the question be now put.
Let me have a look here. I'm looking. Just trying to be even, see who's had some calls. Sue Moroney's only had one call, so I'm going to call her.
Well, thank you, Mr Chair, because I was in the midst of a really important part when the government tried to shut this debate down because they don't want to talk about this part of the bill, which is around the idea that very, very good and well-meaning non-government organisations are being asked to take over the responsibility of the state. Now, on this side of the House, we believe in those organisations having the ability to add to the state's responsibility, but not to replace it. And that's our concern with this part of the bill, because we know that those organisations are very, very good at what they do. But here's what the problem is, and I talked about this a little bit in my Part 1 debate, that actually the main problem is that there is not enough housing. There is not enough housing stock. And until the government actually come face to face with that and admit what the actual problem is and not what the pretend problem is, then they will not make headway on this area. They just won't make headway. And so here's my concern, and I'm going to describe it in terms of a very similar situation that has rolled out in the past in the health area, actually. So we've seen it happen before. I'm going to talk about rest homes in particular. So very, very well-meaning organisations, mostly religious and welfare organisations, actually took over the running of rest home services that were at that time the purview of the state. So the state primarily operated those services for our most vulnerable elderly. And then very well-meaning non-government organisations, as I said before, mostly religious and welfare organisations, took over the job of the state, actually, in that role. Now, that worked out okay for, actually probably pretty well, for 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 years. But less than 2 decades later, what we actually found is that now those rest homes have been almost all on-sold to corporations and to the private sector. Not because those non-government organisations had decided that's what they wanted to do from the outset, not at all. In fact, quite the adverse to that. They really wanted to offer the very best service in aged care. But what they found was that they weren't able to do that in a way that they felt comfortable and good about. It wasn't the sort of service that they could feel that was what they went into it for. And so it was privatised. And that, Mr Chair, is what I see as being a slippery slope with housing. Well-intentioned, actually very experienced non-government organisations, I think, under the sort of government we have in place at the moment, will find that they are completely under-resourced to do the job to their high standards, and may then find that they end up offloading those properties onto the private sector. And that would be an absolute travesty, because what we would then find is that our most vulnerable citizens will be at the mercy of large corporations and private landlords, and isn't that a situation that we already suffer from in this country? It is not the pathway forward. It is not the way to resolve housing problems for our most vulnerable. And can I, Mr Chair, put it in the context of being one of the most fundamental social rights in this country, that every New Zealand citizen should have the right to have an adequate housing, to have a good and adequate roof over their heads. Because we know that when that doesn't happen, our whole country suffers. And it's all very well for the government to congratulate itself week in and week out, as it tends to do, about putting more and more resources into rheumatic fever and the outcomes of children having got rheumatic fever. But wouldn't it be so much better, Mr Chair, if instead of actually dealing with the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, that this government understood the importance of adequate and safe housing to actually prevent children from getting that dreadful third world disease in the first place? Isn't that the sort of country that we should be aiming for? Because I know on this side of the House it is. The vision that Labor has is that we want to ensure that every family has adequate housing, so that we're not talking about, as the government seems to pride itself on, dealing with the outcome of third world country diseases. How hopeless is that?
I call the honourable member Mike Sabin.
I move that the question be now put.
No. I'm going to call a spokesman for the area. And of course, it's the honourable member Philip Twyford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's only you and my mother who call me that. Philip, as opposed to Phil. I want to make some comments about the extension of the income-related rent subsidy to community housing organisations. And we saw the Minister get up a little while ago and, in a great sort of gotcha moment, and challenge Labor to say